Hello and welcome, everyone, on the third of our open lecture series at Jakobsleiter, a peer-reviewed English-speaking journal for high school students. In accordance with our commitment at Jakobsleiter to sort of help young minds to integrate into the scholarly discourses and to be able to make their voices heard, we designed this open lecture series where well-known public scholars and scientists from Hungary are visiting us and giving us a talk and talking to us, and of course talking to all the participants, namely you, the students, who will have a chance to interact similarly to previous sessions with our guests today. So we had two sessions already. 2 weeks ago, we talked to Orsolya Bayer-Molnár, an evolutionary biologist, and 1 week ago, we talked to Ádám Nádasdy, a linguist, a philologist, poet, and translator. I'm saying this because you will have a chance to check out these open lectures because they were recorded, similar to today's open lecture. And the links you will find on our Facebook page or on the Jakobsleiter's webpage. And it is my pleasure to introduce my partner in discussion today and your partner in discussion in about 40 minutes, Professor Csaba Pléh, a well-known scholar in Hungary. At present, he is a distinguished member of Central European University's faculty, but he has been active in quite a huge number of higher education institutions in Hungary in the past few decades. Csaba Pléh is a psychologist, a linguist, a cognitive scientist, a psycholinguist, and a highly venerated scholar. But beyond all this, and this is perhaps the most important reason why we thought of inviting him, is that he's not only a scholar of high qualities, but he's also quite active in the field of public scholarship, namely the translation and transmission of scholarly paradigms and scholarly thought to younger and non-scholarly audiences. And this was perhaps the most important for us because we would like to have people here who are capable of transmitting their knowledge to audiences who are not yet as literate in these scholarly questions as they are. The structure of today's open lecture will be similar to the previous open lectures, in as much as we will start with a 35-40 minutes discussion in which I will sort of interview Csaba with a number of questions, and then we will open the floor for another 45 to 50 minutes for questions from the audience. So I would like to encourage everyone who is present here to start noting down questions or ideas that they have and come up with them at the end or at the second half of this open lecture. You will have 50 minutes to raise your questions, and Csaba is here at your disposal to answer them or to discuss them with you. So with this, I will start now. And in this interview part of the open lecture, I would like to focus on two things. I will first ask a couple of questions about your journey in scholarship and in science, how you become what you are today. And also I would like to ask a couple of specific questions related to your fields of expertise. But I would like to start really with your journey to science. And what I would like to start with is, often we see how singular and seemingly insignificant events in one's life can make a huge impact on scientific careers. And I'm wondering if you can recall any experience from your youth which made you embark on this journey of becoming a scholar.
Well, that's not easy. Because there are two aspects of this. The one aspect is to become a scientist in general. The other is the specific field. Now, I had two different motivations. For becoming a psychology scholar, so sort of a research scientist, I was influenced pretty much by one of my mentors during the early years of my psychology training. At that time, I'm talking about the mid-60s, there was no BA, MA separation, but in fact, there was in psychology. And even it was actually much sharper than it is today, because the first 2 years were only basic science, biology, neurology, anatomy, physiology, mathematics, statistics, genetics, and whatever, plus general experimental psychology. That's it. And then from the third year on, you were taking special classes on development, social psychology. So even the academic fields were divided. First, only the first 2 years, only the basics. So it was like medical training today. But in any case, I was hesitating what to do, and I went for summer, not really internship, but I was working in the summer as an untrained assistant in one of the psychiatric clinics in Hungary, and I sort of became involved in trying to become an applied psychologist. I mean, I had this naive belief that I will be able to help and understand people and so on. And so I was I wanted to become a psychologist, to be a clinical psychologist. And then on one journey, let's see, your basic topic is maps and roads and models and so on. On one journey, I, as already a third year student, I joined the undergraduate first year students who were going with my former teacher of general psychology, Ilona Barkosi. They were going to Veszprém Zoo to see a famous chimpanzee. Then in the 60s, the Veszprém Zoo had the only chimpanzee in Hungary. She was very famous. Her name was Böbe. Several movies were made about Böbe and so on. So the students were going to visit Böbe, so to say, and I joined their trip. And on the trip, my former teacher has become my mentor, because she sort of insisted that I'm too smart to be just a practical psychologist. I should do something more ethical and so on. So I became involved in experimental psychology, and for 3 years I was working on topics that are very far away for me now, on issues of how anxiety, success, and failure are influencing people's imagination and creativity and so on. And then when I was about 24, Barkoczi was still very much helping and mentoring me. So she obtained an assistant job for me at the university, Eötvös University. And there, after working about 1 year, my original dream came back. And that's what my original dream was, when I was a young child, I was raised in a bilingual village in Dunabogdány, near Budapest, north of Budapest, between Szentendre and Visegrad. And it was a bilingual village where we were the Hungarian minority, and the language of the street, and we're talking about the 50s, the Rákosi times, very harsh communist times, blah, blah, blah. Still, the language of the street was Schwabisch, Ungardeutsch. And the majority of the people, so there were about 2,000 Schwabish people and about 200 Hungarians in the whole village at that time. So as a young child, even as a nursery and a kindergarten child, I was always wondering what's the difference between the two languages, blah, blah, blah. So I was very interested in how language is shaping the mind. What is the difference between languages and so on? So when I was already an assistant professor at the psychology department at Eötvös University, I enlisted as a student of linguistics for 3 years. I had a funny position. I was, on the one hand, a Janus face position. I was a teacher, and at the same day, other hours, I was a student. But in contemporary terms, you would think that I was doing actually my PhD work a student of linguistics. And ever since, my basic hope and work is to combine linguistics and psychology to look for the mental representation of grammar and language in general in the human mind, and how language is activated in actual social life and so on. So that's why I've become a scientist in two terms. First, I've become a scientist, a psychologist, and then I came back to my original dream, combining study of language with psychology. And that's what I do in the broader domain of cognitive psychology.
So I'm right assuming that we are in the early 70s at this point.
Yeah, I'm talking about the early 70s. I graduated from linguistics in 74.
Okay,
yeah.
Okay.
And therefore, altogether, I was a student at Eötvös for 10 years, from 64 to 74. Yeah.
Yes. It's, I mean, it happens.
I was a student for 10 years, not because I always failed, but I took other specialties. Yeah.
I think that 74 is an interesting date, and this brings me to one of the key questions that I wanted to pose to you with regards to your career, namely that one of the fields in which you are an expert, cognitive science. As far as I know, the first coining of the term is from 1973. There was a report from an American psychologist who coined the term cognitive science. And what I'm curious about is, when you started engaging with this topic of the combination of linguistics and psychology, were you already aware of the birth of a new field of scholarship, or were you still considered yourself either a linguist or a psychologist? And if so, when did the change occur?
That's extremely important. There was a new trend emerging in many social sciences, in anthropology, linguistics, sociology, and most importantly, psychology, which we called the cognitive term. So cognitive psychology, as a new trend in psychology, not just a new chapter, but a new trend, appeared in the late 60s, has become present in Hungary in the early 70s, partly through my own efforts. But that was not yet the time of cognitive science. I'm going to explain what's the difference between the two. So cognitive psychology started to look at humans as feeling and thinking beings. Well, of course, that's how we always thought of humans. But interestingly, from the late 30s to the mid-60s, in some dominant countries of modern psychology, such as the United States, partly Britain, and also Russia, another vision of humans came up. Humans were treating as behaving and learning organisms, not unlike dogs in Russia and rats in the United States. So animals have become the models of the human mind, and therefore the entire notion of mind was put into parentheses. We were not talking about minds and feelings. So when I was trained as a student, I was trained as a behaviorist, thinking about humans as behaving organisms, studying the stimuli that incited you to raise the glass and drink the water and whatsoever. Now, a cognitive psychologist would take another trend, and rather than trying to understand what were the stimuli that were responsible for your raising the glass, we would be interested in your representation. Why would you think there was water in the glass and stuff like that? So the late 60s in the United States and early 70s in many countries in Europe, including Hungary, were the days of the cognitive, well, we sometimes called it for a while revolution, but even if revolution is an overused word here, there certainly was a cognitive change and a cognitive shift. Going back to the traditional vision of psychology, because we as everyday humans, we all think that the other guy is thinking something and he wants something and he's feeling. So the naive psychology always treats humans as feeling and thinking beings. And cognitive psychology was, after a 30-year objectivistic, deterministic trend, it was taking back the stance. Now, that chapter included as a subchapter psycholinguistics, as psycholinguistics was sort of one shelf on the cupboard of new cognitive psychology. And this new cognitive psychology was treating language as a property of each human being. So language is not just a structure you find in lexicons and grammar books on your shelf, but language is also part of your mind, okay? And that's what the psycholinguistic trend. Now, just, I will cut it short. In about a 15-year period, gradually, the victory of the cognitive trend in many fields have raised voices that we have to unite these efforts and find something common and joint between psychology, linguistics, philosophy, biology, evolution, and so on. And that's how cognitive science as a trend came up. So cognitive science came as a need to do interdepartmental communication, which was in many ways initiated and led by the cognitive psychologists, but it was sort of a more abstract level move. Yeah.
You were just saying, and perhaps this brings us over to the field of psycholinguistics specifically. You were just mentioning this impression that humans always assume that there is a mind in the other human as well. This theory of mind, right? That there is someone with which I'm interacting. And one of the things which always interests me is the primary way in which we are trying to estimate the intelligence of our interlocutor, of the person with whom we are talking, is to look at the language they use, right? And we often have this impression that if someone uses very complex patterns of speech, then he or she might be very well educated, might be very intelligent, and so on and so forth. And I'm wondering, is it, first of all, is this true, or is this a good way of assuming what type of intelligence we are facing when we're talking about the humans, or when we are talking about the chimpanzee and we have a sign language with which we are communicating? And secondly, and more importantly, beyond the intelligence that the language reports on, does it also report on the personality of the individual with which we are communicating?
Yeah, let me first address the issue of humans and animals and so on. Let me show you a few examples how we compare humans and animals. So let me show you how we do with animals. Because the general topic of this excursion for the Jakobsleiter this fall is going to be maps and models, right? So let's talk a little bit about maps in animals. Already in the behaviorist times, we found that even simple beings like rats are not as simple as just behave like turning right and left and so on. If the animal learns that the foot is facing him, you can see on the left side of this showed, and then you make a barrier here. You see the barrier. Then the animal will take the detour route, the yellow road, the detour route to find the food. Now that means that the animal formed, as Tolman called it, a cognitive map in his brain somehow of the environment. He's not just learning where to turn and so on. So one interesting thing, talking about different abilities of humans and animals, that animals, rodents and dogs and cats certainly, are locomotive beings who are forming maps of the environment, but they are not able to talk about those maps. Let me show you one more example, a Hungarian example. One of my mentors, Lajos Kardos at Eötvös University, had shown what he called the mnemic field, that rats are actually not only forming maps of the route, how to approach something, but they also learn that in some places, some things are present. So compare the upper and the lower chart. The animal in the lower chart has to learn that if he goes to the left, then he will get food, E2. And if he goes to the right, he will get water, E1. That's a very easy task. Turn left, you get food. Turn right, you get water. Now, imagine the following thing. The animal gets food or water on the same place, depending whether he turned left or he turned right. So the animal has to learn, if I turn left, then I receive food. So it's on the same place, depending on the road, there is either food or drink. That's impossible. So the animal is in fact attaching certain things to certain places, and it's extremely different to learn that different things can be at the same place. That's about the animals. Now, let's move a little bit. What happens with humans? With humans, I am having a wrong slide here, but don't worry. I will stop sharing and explain that humans not only have, we also have cognitive maps. Of course, we know the road, how to go home, and so on, but we also have semantic maps. In the human mind, different categories are stored as if they were maps. So we know that parrots are birds, and birds are animals, and animals can breathe and eat and stuff like that. So there is a hierarchy of features, and in our semantics of language, we are forming other types of maps. So it's very interesting and challenging regarding the notion of maps, that while animals are certainly able to have maps of the environment, we also have internal maps of the meanings of the semantic environment, and that's not available for animals. So by introducing labels and linguistic semantics, you are able to mirror different aspects of the word. Now, that's about animal-human difference in regarding maps. Your other question was that in language use, does language use also show something about our personality, mirror who we are, and so on? Of course it does. So the choices we make are choices by which we indicate our emotional status. When I am offered a piece of peach, I can say, oh, nice, or I can say, oh, what a nice, lovely piece of peach. And by that, I'm trying to express my emotional status, but also our personality is certainly marked in many regards in our speech style, in our choice of expressions, but also in our organization of dialogue structure. So, for example, dominant people, I mean, whose personality is dominant, are interrupting others much more frequently compared to submissive people. Uh, Extroverted people are using much more adverbs expressing emotions and so on compared to introverted people. So there is a sort of a stylistic chapter here also.
What you say sort of implies that language is a representation of whatever is happening within in our minds. But I'm wondering, since speaking or expressing language in any form is a very active thing, does it have an effect on our personality? So does this work the other way around as well? If I start using certain things, would it make me different in terms of style, personality, knowledge, and so on and so forth?
Yeah, it's a very valid and important question. In general, for example, the use of harsh language that appears today pretty much on social media. That's why I stopped. I don't use Facebook or anything. I don't even mention what I don't use. I stopped because of the language, because I felt that the enforced language with the short commands and so on, it was actually moving my mood to the negative side and so on. So many studies show that the use of harsh language and the social sort of reinforcement for the use of harsh language is many times, in fact, inducing negative moods and negative social contact makings and so on. So we are pretty responsible for not letting that to happen. I think longitudinal studies, they are starting because with the big data revolution in many social sciences, we will have available billions of expressions found on the internet in the different social media. And I think people just started to study how this might affect you over in the long term. So we are in the process of understanding this more precisely.
One of the premises of our discussion so far is the sort of similarity of humans in terms of intellectual capabilities, that we start with the assumption that we are all capable of similar feats when we are talking about language, when we're talking about intellect, understanding, map making, and so on and so forth. And yet what we see in our ordinary life is a dazzling array of intellectual differences between humans, both in terms of capabilities and in terms of ways of thinking. And I'm wondering, when we talk about cognitive science or cognitive psychology, how does this scholarly paradigm in general explains the differences that we experience between humans?
Yeah, that's a very interesting and important question. Most of the modern cognitive science, when it was born in a universalistic belief. It was, as Noam Chomsky, the famous linguist, expressed it, we sort of live in a revival stage of Cartesianism, in the sense that we believe that there is a universal human nature, which if we believe in universal human nature, we also believe that it's somehow biologically preconditioned. So it's not God-given. Of course, you might speculate here, but still it's formed by evolution and so on. But interestingly, that was true, this universalistic attitude was true until the mid-1990s. Okay? But from the mid-1990s on, several stars in cognitive science, such as Steven Pinker, you can read Pinker's book in Hungarian and in English. So Steven Pinker started to associate the cognitive trend with an interest in individual differences. Many other people, including Gary Marcus, a former student of Pinker and so on, also got involved into this. Now, how can you combine a belief in biologically determined individual variation and a belief in universal human nature? There are many ways recent developmental studies try to tackle on this. I use these funny term developmental studies because that's for the high schoolers. I tell you, when you will be doing your research work as adults and so on, developmental studies will be a much more important field than it is today. Today, it's a combination of developmental psychology and developmental biology. We want to understand how, at what stages of development are different cognitive systems shaped. So what are the critical stages for shaping theory of mind or forming language? Because language is a very interesting example. We believe that in its underlying structure, it's a biological given. No matter how much you talk to your cat, the cat won't speak back to you. Okay. You might interpret some behaviors of the cat that she may have some sort of elementary theory of mind, like understanding your mood, not understanding your thoughts. Again, being associated with your moods. And dogs can certainly follow your gaze, so they have a perceptual theory about where you look and so on. But only dogs. Other mammals don't do that. But going back, so it might language. Language is certainly human specific, but it's still somehow acquired because we learn Hungarian, other kids learn Chinese, still others learn English between 1 and 4, right? So how this system stabilizes and so on, and how does the planning system and the self-control stabilize in puberty between 14 and 18 years of age. All of these lead to important individual differences because of the stabilization. We don't exactly understand the mechanisms, but we have some speculations how critical events might be important in deciding and shaping your personality style and your behavior in the future. So we are looking towards a new psychology of individual differences based on cognitive science and studies of cognition. Yeah.
Before I would open the floor for the audience to ask questions. So guys, prepare yourself. In a couple of minutes, you will have the chance to speak up. I just want to bring up one more topic just to further spice the discussion. and namely that of consciousness. We have been talking about language, we have been talking about theory of mind, and one of the other basic premises for all our conversations about human minds is that there is such a thing as consciousness, whatever it might be, some sort of a self-reflection about our existence and about the existence of our minds. I'm wondering, because I have done a little bit of research for this interview as well as for other topics, and I was trying to get a good definition of consciousness, and I didn't really find one.
Yeah.
What is the status here?
I was pretty hesitant to use the word consciousness because of my upbringing. I was brought up in a communist country, and fortunately the youth listening to this talk doesn't know this, but in my high school years, in my early university years, Tudat and tudatosság, consciousness, being consciousness, blah, blah, blah. It was all Communist Party, blah, blah, blah. I'm not joking. So consciousness as a term in my youth meant something that was unfounded, unscientific, and it was sort of an expression of the will of the working class to overcome all difficulties. So consciousness was sort of an effort concept that okay, there are instinctive reactions and consciousness, and conscious is the real, la la la. So I hated this as an unscientific term. But of course, in modern cognitive science, I have to lose this emotional upbringing, negative feelings. Now, there are still many debates, but we have to know that consciousness has two important aspects. One aspect is what you refer to as being aware of myself, is so access consciousness. On the other is process consciousness. So, and regarding this, we know that for about a time of 200 to 500 milliseconds, so 2/10 to 1/2 of a second, we are not really conscious of what's happening, but we are still acting intelligently. So, for example, in reading, when you read, you move your eyes to the next word unconsciously, but if the next word is interesting, a funny word or something, you are more likely to fixate on this word than on another word. So now what determines this fixation? It's a pre-conscious processing of that very word. It's already a semantic determination. So in the recent times, we see that there are many unconscious semantic factors that are happening over very short time windows. That's responsible for the speed of human processing. If you read the book of Daniel Kahneman called Gyors és lassú, so fast and slow.
Mm-hmm. In the English title is Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow.
Slow, right.
Yeah.
Okay, so Kahneman really shows us how smart the fast processes can be, and how we still need slow processes. His argument for slow processes is that if we have to build models of huge data sets, then we need a long time and so on. These huge data sets, just think of like writing a homework, an essay for your class of English or your class of history. You make a plan of the outline and blah, blah, blah. It might take minutes and hours to elaborate. And so we believe today, okay, that it's a very interesting issue of how consciousness moves between the fast and slow windows. That's one aspect of consciousness. The other aspect is, of course, the control issue, because we also have consciousness that relates to planning, execution, and control over our own behavior. We pretty much know that there is a back to front gradient here in the brain. Or experiential consciousness is mainly happening in the back parts of the brain, in the special perceptual areas like the visual brain and so on. Okay? And control consciousness is mainly happening through the working of our prefrontal areas here. So there is a lot of interesting new things happening regarding consciousness, especially with very fine temporal study. You know, when I was a student, it was very hard to talk about differences between 100 and 200 milliseconds. Only on Olympic championships were you measuring such short times. Now it's everyday laboratory practice. It also in stimulation, but also in analyzing behavior. So we are much finer tuned temporally. Yeah.
Thank you. So at this point, we are exactly in 45 minutes into our open lecture. I would like to ask members of the audience to come forward and start asking their questions. I'm sure there are many questions here. We have touched upon a couple of topics. There are multiple further topics that you can bring up. So feel free to come forth and ask your questions or bring up your points. I'm sure someone will dare to break the silence. Yes, go on, Yurchi.
So I'm really interested in the topic of consciousness, and my question is that using this kind of definition and these kind of mechanisms that you talked about, can we say that animals are also conscious beings, or are just humans conscious?
Well, that's a very challenging question for the last 200 years. It divides the cognitive community. Most of us believe that higher mammals, such as our domestic animals, also higher mammals such as the primates, dolphins, whales, are conscious of certain events. They certainly have perceptual consciousness, but they don't really have executive consciousness. So they are having interesting executive functions, but they are not able to meditate on those executive functions. Let me tell you one example. We know, for example, from field studies, lions, that lions are big social hunters. They're extremely smart in social hunting, and in some habitats, some parts of Africa, they also develop strategies to push grazing animals towards areas of two river meetings where they sort of encircle them. So they know, in very simple terms, they know that the animals, I mean the grazing animals want to eat water. So the one part of the lion horde is chasing them in a certain direction towards the water, and another part of the gang is waiting in certain areas of the river bank where the others chase the animals. Now, that's pretty complicated planning, but we don't assume to be conscious because, for example, it doesn't easily transfer to another setting. So if you move the poor lions in cages to another riverbank, they will have to have 2 other years to learn how to do the same thing there, while humans would do the same thing there immediately. So that is a big graduality issue here regarding what animals are conscious. Of course, there are strong movements in the vegan camp who meditate on a philosophical ground that because it's very difficult to make a sharp line below which animals are not conscious, therefore it's safer not to eat any animals. But that's going beyond cognition proper, though one of the leaders of modern science, Stephen Harnad, a Hungarian-born Canadian scholar, Hernad István, he's a very philosophical vegan because of these reasons. So he combines his conviction in cognitive science about animal consciousness by not eating meat. Matteo, yeah.
Or we have a next question.
Yes, I'd just like to ask, even though that at the end your main subject isn't clinical psychology, did you ever practice as a clinical psychologist?
No. I mean, I had a half a year internship and but other than that, for my degree, but not really, no.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. There was a question in the chat which I somehow deleted.
No worries, I have it. So the question is from Peter Simmons. It sounds like it goes as follows. You have worked with people who are schizophrenic. Are there any commonalities in psycholinguistic difference between them and, in quotation marks, normal people?
Well, in psycholinguistic terms, the overall observation that was already 100 years ago that many schizophrenic people are using abstract language, that's proven with new, more careful data gathering. So there are many interesting stylistic differences, but that's not so strong or so striking as you would be able to use language as a sort of symptomatology marker for diagnosis. No. So it's interesting for research purposes, the use of abstract terms and sometimes neologisms that really is documented today. Yeah. So, Balint.
Yes, you mentioned the name of Noam Chomsky,
Yeah.
and it came to my mind that what is your opinion about let's say his war with George Lakoff and Ronald Langecker, and the whole cognitive linguistic, functional cognitive linguistic branch?
Yeah. Well, I'm a Chomskyan. I can't change this. That's how I turned linguist in the early 70s. Of course, I think that there is a proper field of study where you can study pragmatic aspects of language use and so on, but I'm not too favorable towards the general Lakoff style overuse of metaphors, just for those who were not into linguistics. So Lakoff is a person who thinks that basically there is no literal and metaphoric language. Everything is metaphoric. And those conceptual metaphors that are sometimes shown in everyday language, like you're dating a girl and now you're moving together in a flat and you're telling her, oh, we have come a long way, baby. So that in the interpretation of Lakoff, that shows that there is an overwhelming dominant metaphor of life as a pathway all the time, and we interpret all social events along the pathway and so on. I think that is true that we do this interpretation, but I think that there is still grammar. So the way I don't agree with Lakoff and Langecker, that they are ignoring grammar and only thinking that these interesting aspects of non-trivial language use are all that is interesting in language. That's not true. You still differentiate, even if you're thinking about we have come a long way, baby, you have to explain the plural and singular agreement and so on. So there is still grammar. And I think grammar is more, well, that's a question of taste. In my kind of psycholinguistics, grammar is more interesting than the secondary uses of language. So, well, that was more an expression of a conviction rather than a solution to a puzzle. There is a real tension between the two groups. Attila.
Yes, you have talked about the cognitive maps of animals and humans, and if I recall correctly, one of the distinctions that you have made is that animals can share their cognitive maps with other.
Yeah, exactly.
So then my question is, what about bees, for example, who with their dances can share with others the direction and the distance of the desired field of flowers, for example?
Yeah.
Would that,
That's extremely interesting and extremely important. So because the B type of communication, that's why von Frisch called it language of the bees, is the most important animal communication system, where the communication system has a structural alignment with features of the environment. Because monkeys, already vervet monkeys, certainly use alarm calls that are somehow related to the kind of danger. So they use a different alarm call when an eagle is approaching, and another alarm call when a leopard, and a third one when a snake is approaching, right? We know that because if we use tape recorded monkey signs and we make a eagle alarm call, then the other monkey will look up. And if we use a snake alarm call, then the monkey would look down. So, but these are individual signs. In the interest of bee language and some other insect languages is that there is a structural correspondence. Still, there is one difference, a structural correspondence between the state of affairs in the world, like how distant and in what direction, and the dance, the direction of the dance, the angle, and the speed of the dance. The big difference is that this is still a closed system. So they are using 5 or 6 different speeds and 8 or 10 different directions. So altogether, there is something like less than 100 correspondence variations between the state of the word, However, in human languages, even if we are not concentrating on the very tricky issue of syntax, the number of signs corresponding to objects in the word, like eyeglass and pen and whatever, even in the non-written languages, is in the magnitude of 10,000. And of course, in our language, it's in the magnitude of at least 50,000. Children around 6 already handle 30,000 words. So if we assume that bees have 100 signs, we are two magnitudes better than them. So there is a extreme quantitative difference. That's also true for word learning. Many studies had shown, our Hungarian studies also, that children between 2 and 4 can learn the meaning of a new word, such as a pen drive, if you show them the pen drive 3 times and you tell pen drive, then the 4th time they will be able to differentiate the pen drive from this stapler, right? So they will learn what pen drive means. These 3-4 times. For chimpanzees, we need 300 to 500 occasions. Again, we are 2 magnitudes better. That's a lot of difference. And of course, many studies Andor already mentioned the theory of mind issue. Many studies in the theory of mind show that this kind of 2 magnitude superiority of humans in word learning over chimpanzees is related to our theory of mind somehow. Yeah.
Thank you.
I thank you.
I think Peter has a question.
Yes. As you were pointing out in the last example, learning differences between object signs is something that's very visually dominated. But one thing that's always fascinated me about consciousness are people like Helen Keller, people who are blind and deaf. And what is the nature of the representational world that they experience compared with us? How do you explain it, and are they experiencing really the same as us? She could write books, but was what she was writing about? How much did it have in common with what we seeing people have?
That's a very interesting and important question, because in our experiential consciousness, we certainly are not having the same experience as blind people when we are using words, but they also sort of have an elaborate internal life with bodily images from other sources, such as touch, bodily sensations, and so on. So Helen Keller wrote her book, but since then there were many other studies which wanted to make serious comparison over samples of 10, 15 children of the inner world of deaf-mute people with hearing speaking people. I'm not easily citing these works. Some of these works were done in Russia, because after about 10 years, it came out that some of them were fakes. So we're still answering, we're fakes in the sense that the psychologists reported that the subjects had no help for the trainer and so on, but in reality they had help from the table. So there are very few reliable data on the internal world of deaf-mute people, unfortunately. So that's the future task for cognitive science.
Good, thank you.
Go on, the floor is yours, guys. Perhaps while you gather your thoughts, I just want to sort of move over or sort of bring the conversation over to another topic that you mentioned. And just on Attila's question, you talked about the magnitudes of difference with which human communication is more complex or more, has more of a content or a bigger amount of symbols or signs for describing things. And this would imply, and I think this is a general expectation between when we look at the difference between humans and animals, that humans are thinking in more complex patterns, are capable of much more intellectually. I've seen an interesting experiment about memory, short-term memory recollection, in which chimpanzees had to remember the order of numbers appearing on a screen and humans had to remember. And to my surprise, obviously, what I saw that humans can remember, I don't know the exact figures, 3-4 numbers in a sequence, and chimpanzees could remember 25, 27 numbers in a sequence in a very, very short term. So it seems that there are certain things, intellectual capabilities, or things that we would describe in human terms as intellectual capabilities, in which animals are beating us easily.
Yeah.
So how does this relate to this magnitudes of difference when it comes to language, for example? Is it easy to describe the difference between the two types of minds?
Not really. There are, in comparative psychology from the time of Lloyd Morgan in the late 19th century, he was an early Darwinian, we have two basic approaches. One approach is that every species has everything but to a much lower level. So there is a gradation thing. Other people, including myself, we believe that there is a qualitative difference. Some species develop mental abilities in order to deal with their environmental challenges, and therefore the easiest examples are echolocation in certain animals that live in the dark and so on. So the environmental challenges are responsible for the development of cognitive abilities. Certain visual abilities of humans have certainly been related to our late ancestry 3 million years ago in the tropical rainforest where the chimpanzees live now, because we had to be able to discriminate colors to get the ripe fruits. And second, we had to be able to see in 3 dimensions to jump from one tree to the other. And third, we had to have very sharp contrasting functions to see approaching predators in the shadow of the tree leaves. So we have to have an anti-camouflage vision. Now, these visual systems, that's make it possible 3 million years later, all the beautiful paintings we have and everything. But it's not true that these developed in order to allow Picasso to be such a good painter, they developed for us to survive in the forest. It's an interesting issue regarding interspecies differences and so on, that evolution is conservative also in the sense that we don't stop things when they are not needed. So since we started to live on flat lands and to do agriculture, okay, farming, we did not need such a sharp space vision compared to when we were living on the trees, but we still have it. So it's not that if you don't need it, you will just underdevelop it. We have many ancestral abilities that were developed in evolutionary already non-valid environments that are non-valid today.
Does that explain how we are different? I mean, it certainly explains how we have been endowed with such intellectual capabilities that we have now, what we possess now. But I think the question was more towards whether it is an accurate representation of the difference between animals and humans, that we are thinking in more complex terms only on the basis of language, when we see that in other intellectual achievements, certain animal species are doing much far better than us.
Yeah, okay. But when you see the number recognition of the chimpanzees, these famous studies by Livingstone and so on, you have to understand one thing. Unlike human children and human adults, they don't have the semantics of the numbers. They are just dealing with those numbers as shapes while we're dealing with their value. And that carries, of course, a lot of semantic burden on the shapes for us, while it doesn't carry the semantic burden for the chimpanzee.
Thank you. I'm wondering if the audience has other questions. We still have some time. Yeah, Attila, please go on.
So another question came to my mind is, we have talked a lot about perception, memory, and learning in terms of space. But what about time? Do animals or chimpanzees, or how do they perceive time, if they perceive it at all, or how is their consciousness compute time, or do they have this dimension at all, or is this just, does this affect them only in the term of memory?
Yeah,
so,
that's an extremely important issue. In most studies, we realize that they don't have a sort of a conscious feeling of time, so they are not having that. But okay, so they don't have a conscious feeling of time. At the same time, they accommodate to differences in the time of the day, so a cat behaves very differently as night approaches and so on. So they have sensitivity to signs of time changes, which for us, for humans, are signs for conscious time change, but for them, they're just signs of change of activity or activity pattern. On the other hand, of course, in humans as well, and as in most complex vertebrate animals, there is a temporal organization of movement. We have to organize not only in speech, but in walking, running, holding, grazing, and so on. We have to have a melody of the muscle timings. And in this regard, most of the mammalian system is very similar. So we use neural timing to coordinate intentional action and muscle movements, and only in strong neurological disorders like Parkinson's disease would you have timing errors in movement organization. So there is, in this other sense of the word time, they are similar to each other. Attila, can I ask you one question?
Yes, sure.
Yeah. Are you related to Lajos Izsó, the ergonomist and industrial psychologist?
I have no knowledge about that, but maybe
okay.
I do not know.
Well, his son is around 35 now and is an economist. I know one son of his, but yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I don't think so. My grandfather was a doctor.
No, I was just curious because Izsó is a rather rare name. Yeah.
We still have time for further questions, so feel free, guys, to jump in at this point. Go on, Barry.
Okay, one more question about linguistics, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure.
What do you think? What will these big corpora that they are building these days? You know, several hundred millions of words. Will these, in some way,
change linguistics? Yes.
Change linguistics and psycholinguistics.
Definitely, they did already. I'm very happy for this question. They already changed my approach to psycholinguistics as well. As I told you, I'm a Chomskyan, and there are many aspects of Chomsky, being a Chomskyan, but one aspect is being structural rather than statistical. Now, Chomsky in the 50s had an easy victory because he was claiming that it's impossible to have so-called Markov chain, so probability-based models of language behavior. He was proving it on algebraic basis. But there was no one to counterproof him because no one had the Sitzfleisch, as the Germans say, the power to sit for ages to compute the frequency of certain words after other words and so on. Now, this is easily done. And what happens in psycholinguistics, there are two camps now regarding big data. One camp believes that big data can steal the show. So there is no need to grammar. It's another term. It's another counter-revolution, not like Lakoff. This counter-revolution says we just have to make many computations, and then all complex language behavior is actually statistically predictable. What it means in psycholinguistics that our general statistical learning procedures will explain all phenomena of language acquisition and language processing. That's a radical group. There are radicals like this. There is a combination group, I belong to the combination group, that believes that when you're processing language, you're not stopping your mind's computational statistical abilities. Let me tell you language processing example. So in language processing, when you listen to fastly moving speech, because speech is actually very fast, in 1 second, you hearing 5 syllables on the average. It's a pretty fast process, and you still understand the speech. And we believe that in this process, statistical prediction and grammar combine together for the fast performance. We have done many studies on Hungarian morphology and word recognition to prove this. that there is actually a dual process. There is statistical prediction, which is actually we made experiments where we made the statistical predictions on the basis of huge corpora, not billions of words, but corpora of 500 million words and 1 billion words and so on, and predictions based on grammar. And usually what happened in real time was that people were using the statistical predictions in their speech understanding, but and usually they arrived to a click of understanding when there was no more entropy to resolve. So there is actually, we assume now that the process of understanding is a twofold process. There is an understanding of putting the grammatical roles into the names and also predicting the incoming information. So I hope I didn't bore with this the non-linguistic people here.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question. So whoever feels the courage to come forward at this late in the open lecture, you should do this right now. I have like many more questions, so I can always jump in, but I would rather like someone else to bring up something. No one seems to be willing.
I have a question to Balint.
Sure, please do. Yeah.
Balint, Tanos, what are you up to? Are you doing linguistics or what?
Yes, I'm a linguist, and I'm turning from cognitive linguistics to statistical linguistics right now. So that's why I'm asking this.
Where do you study?
Oh, I had a PhD in ancient languages from 2013, but I did other stuff the last years. But I want to get back to linguistics.
Oh, good. So. Good luck.
Thank you very much.
Perhaps just as an afterthought to many of the themes that came up, and perhaps it wraps up the discussion in a good way. We have been talking about how there are multiple things that are changing and that are enabling us both in linguistics and in cognitive science to see things in a very different way. We have statistical data, we have big data, and so on and so forth. And so the question that comes to my mind is, when we look at people who are young at this point in time and who have been brought up in a very different environment than the environment in which you, Csaba, or in which even I or Balint myself have been brought up, in terms of access to data, in terms of access to computational capacity outside of our human brains. Do you think that in the field of either psycholinguistics or cognitive science, we can see structural differences about the ways in which people think, or our brains, going on with your narrative of conservative evolutionary principles, our brains are the same, and it's just we are using different tools now?
That's extremely important. Literacy has an effect. Studies in Amazonia and Mexico with illiterate people and people only having a few years of literacy training had shown that Luria, a Russian psychologist, was right in the 1930s. He made the first observations in Uzbekistan that people, absolutely illiterate people, are not able to use a totally formal way of thought. Let me illustrate it. One example. You tell someone in the area of Uzbekistan, which is a semi-desert drought area in the southern Eurasian plain. So you're talking to a peasant there, and you tell him that on the North Pole, all bears are white. Misha is a bear living on the North Pole. So, and then the peasant replies, I have never been to the North Pole. How should I know? A normal Hungarian 8-year-old child would make the deduction. Therefore, Misha is white, right? So we are able to make formal things. Or one more example. In Moscow, everybody is bald. Sasha lives in Moscow, does. Then the peasant replies, there is no such thing as everybody is bald. Now, you can see that we are using logical frames even if they are counterintuitive, because the peasant is right. Not everybody is bald. You see my point? Now, the studies in Amazonia and Mexico had shown that 2 years of literacy training in an alphabetic language is enough to turn us towards the formal mode of thought. So in an interesting way, you were asking about qualitative differences. It seems to be that the spread of literacy has led to the spread of logics rather than pragmatics. So Lakovian linguistics, Balint, is totally explaining the mind of illiterate people. But we hope we're not all illiterate.
Okay, I think this is the same argument as Flynn made about the Flynn effect, right?
Yeah.
That we are becoming, in a sense, more and more capable of solving complex logical puzzles due to our environment. So, and what is it that you predict about the generation that is growing up now, which is not only literate but literate in another way, for the first time?
That's an interesting question. I think you will see it in 20 years' time. That there are many pessimists and many over-optimists. I'm in the middle of the road person here. But I think in some areas, your generation is facing challenges. Already, okay, by the use of handheld computing devices, the use of mental arithmetics is decreasing. So if I tell you, tell me how much is 12 by 16, we mostly write it down, blah, blah, blah. But most of young kids today would punch it into their phone and so on. Now, that's important, not because it's so important to know the computation, because we always forget that by doing arithmetics in writing and mental computation, we are actually practicing our working memory. So there might be changes to our working memory system, to your working memory system, to the negative. So I think, let me end it with a sort of pun kind of note. I think that in the coming 10 years, Wall Street is going to hire those brokers who can still mentally calculate the risks and so on, while the others are punching into the softwares. They will still have mental estimations of what's going to happen to this stock and so on.
All right.
And also the other effect where many people are feeling dangers is that by the constantly changing textual and visual environment on the net, people will have difficulties for a long time fun reading. So reading novels and so on, which is again an extremely important memory exercise. When you read Tolstoy's War and Peace, every night when you pull the book again, you activate a file where you have the personalities of the actors and Anna and Vronsky, and you see my point. So you really have to reactivate, and that's, again, if you're not doing this kind of reading, that might result in less planning and less sort of long-term stability. Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much. I will say we should conclude our meeting today. We have come to the end of our time. So this was our third and last lecture in the open lecture series of the summer of 2021, moving towards the submission date of Jakobsleiter, which is going to be the 15th of September. So there is still plenty of time for any student who wishes to write. And these open lectures were basically serving as teasers, as idea provokers for those who are interested in this question of maps and models. And I just want to reiterate, we are open for any English-speaking publication or any English-speaking submission in any scientific field, especially in interdisciplinary fields, which deals with the question of maps and models. And it is really up to the submitter to decide how to interpret this or to what fields to apply this. And just another note, because I see a couple of students here, if you are thinking about entering this opportunity of submitting an article to Jakobsleiter, you should definitely check out our webpage and our Facebook page and sign up for our newsletter, because only those students who signed up to our newsletter will be invited to participate in the writing workshop. Obviously, we cannot work with those students who we don't know about. So please do sign up to our newsletter, which will translate into us communicating to you and probably inviting you for a writing workshop where we help you develop your respective articles and respective topics. But I don't want to steal the show for Jakobsleiter. I just wanted to note this because this is the last of the open lecture. So the only thing that remains for me to say is I would like to thank you all for coming, and I would like to especially thank Csaba for being available for today on this very hot day and for answering all of these questions and for bringing these very interesting topics to our discussion. Thank you, Csaba.
Well, thank you for your attention and good luck for your submissions.
Thank you. Have a nice day, everyone. We'll see each other in some form or shape soon, I'm certain. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye.